is Charlie Rose.
Rex Tillerson is here. He is chairman and CEO of Exxon Mobil. It is the world's largest refiner of petroleum products. He joined Exxon in 1975 as a 24-year-old engineer and has held a variety of foreign and domestic leadership roles. Today, he is positioning the company to capture the promise of the natural gas revolution. As the world transitions to cleaner fuels, natural gas and electricity are expected to account for more than 60% of the world's energy demand by 2040. In 2009, he orchestrated the acquisition of XTO Energy for over $30 billion. It remains Exxon's largest deal since the mega merger with Mobil in 1999. I am pleased to have Rex Tillerson on this program. Welcome.
Thank you, Charlie. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let me talk about news first quickly. Hugo Chavez, what impact will his death and whatever changes that might take place in Venezuela mean for the oil industry?
Well, it's very early to tell. Obviously, he has just now passed away, and under their Constitution, it calls for them to hold elections within 30 days because he never stood for inauguration. And I think until we see the outcome of that election, and in particular, we see how organized the opposition parties may be able to get themselves together for the election, it's going to be hard to tell what the immediate effect will be and whether his successor chooses to carry on his programs, and in particular the focus of his programs and the alliances that he established, or whether they choose to broaden out their perspectives. And I think at this stage it's very difficult to tell what the successor may choose to do.
He nationalized the oil industry in Venezuela.
Well, they always had a national oil company, PDVSA. Right. When he took over, he did narrow the scope of the holdings of the international oil companies, changed the contracts, and invited us to either accept the new contracts or to leave the country, and I accepted his invitation to leave the country.
And will you go back now if the government has a different policy?
Well, again, I think it's a little bit early to tell. Certainly a number of things would need to change to make the investment climate there much more attractive for us, and I think for others as well, and to gain the security around those investments that we would want to return. We have been in and out of Venezuela before. We were in Venezuela, we left Venezuela, we went back, and we left again. So it's certainly something that we will keep our eye on as to what policy choices they may make.
There's also the question of oil prices today. They've risen dramatically recently at the pump. What's causing it?
Well, this run-up recently of gasoline prices in particular is fairly predictable seasonally here in the United States. The oil price has actually been pretty stable for the last 12 months. It's kind of hovering in the $100 to $110, $115 a barrel Brent range, and so it has actually had little volatility. But the run-up in gasoline prices that people have been interested in really occurred for a couple of reasons. One, we always have refinery maintenance early in the year as we are preparing to change the gasoline blend from winter-grade gasoline to summer-grade gasoline to comply with environmental regulations. This year was an extraordinarily heavier year in refinery maintenance, and there's no particular reason for that other than refineries have certain units that must be maintained. They have to take them completely out of service every 2 to 3 years to do that, and a number of those just happened to line up on the schedule this year across the industry. So refinery utilization rates dropped into the low 80s for a period while that was going on, and they're now gradually returning those units to service, and so we would expect that the gasoline prices have moderated now. In fact, I think you're already beginning to see a little bit of a drop.
So going into the summer, it'll be lower?
Pending what the oil price does, because the fact of the matter is, in a gallon of gasoline, 88% of that price is determined by the oil price and state and federal taxes. So watch the oil price because it will directly influence where gasoline prices will go.
When you look at this administration and energy policies, one of the key things is the Keystone Pipeline. Now I had the State Department saying that they think it should go ahead effectively.
They're saying it again, that it should go ahead. This is a project that's been 4 years in the regulatory process, over 100 public meetings, town hall meetings were conducted around the process for this pipeline permit. Preliminary environmental impact statement was prepared, a draft environmental impact statement, a supplemental environmental impact statement, and now a second supplemental environmental impact statement have been prepared, with now 2 findings by the State Department that there will be no measurable harm to the environment by allowing the project to go forward. So it's an extremely important project, I think, to the United States of America. It's certainly an important project to Canada, and we would hope that sufficient work has now been done that people would allow the project to proceed. I think it is an important example of part of the regulatory struggles that we have in this country. The processes are extremely lengthy. They're subject to reopening, they're subject to challenge, and oftentimes when one gets to what you believe you have followed all the steps of the process and satisfied, you still cannot get the permit that you're seeking.
Why do you think environmental groups made such a priority of the Keystone Pipeline?
Well, I would not want to speak for all environmental groups because there are a number of different interested parties out there. I think broadly speaking, there is a segment of the environmental groups who are very concerned about the burning of fossil fuels. They're very concerned about the development of fossil fuels and new sources. And I think in a sort of obtuse way, they took a view that if they could prevent the transport of the crude oil from Canada to the United States, then that would throw an obstacle in the way of future developments. I think they've probably misjudged Canada's resolve to see its natural resources developed.
When you look at a carbon tax, you're in favor of it.
Well,
you're not opposed to it.
Here's the way I would characterize that, Charlie. I think at some point as policymakers get around to wanting to deal with additional policies around climate, and in particular around ways in which policies can incentivize certain behavior in consumers and investors, there are a lot of different models that people have discussed, one of which is cap and trade, which Europe has been trying now for some time to not a lot of great success, partly because of the economic depression, recession that Europe has been suffering now and finds themselves in. My view on it has been, if you're going to undertake a policy that has those characteristics, my view is a carbon tax is much more straightforward. It's much simpler to administer, and it does not leave itself open to as much gaming of the system as a trading platform does. A trading platform is going to impose a certain transactional cost in the system.
Yeah, you prefer that to more regulation.
Well, it depends on the regulation, quite frankly, and how that regulation is structured. I would say this. I think as you look at the success the United States has already achieved in addressing CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions.
Those successes you are in favor of in terms of what they've done on emission standards?
I think clearly they have been beneficial.
To the country and
to the country. Now, climate change and managing greenhouse gas emissions is not a single country issue. We all know that. And the U.S. could cut its emissions to zero and perhaps still never influence the outcome. But if you look at where we find ourselves today, compared to 1992, our greenhouse gas emissions today are as low as they've been since 1992. That's while we're consuming about 15% more energy, and we got an economy that's 60% larger. So clearly, a lot of policies around energy efficiency, some regulatory driven, but some simply driven by businesses seeing this as an opportunity to capture products and services that the public wants because the public wants to lower their own emissions. And so it's a combination, I think, of a number of things, some regulatory driven, some education driven, some marketing driven to the public that has produced the result we're seeing today. And we see more of that ahead of us in the future. Some facilitated and incentivized by regulation, which we think is sensible, and some simply driven by the public's desire to continue to improve in this area.
Speaking of global warming, how are you different than Lee Raymond, your predecessor, who had outspoken views about global warming?
Well, I think in terms of my view of where we find ourselves on our understanding of global warming, we have continued to study this issue for decades. I think we probably, as a corporation, were one of the first companies to identify this as a potential issue because we are a fossil fuels-based company. And Lee and others before him had undertaken studies. They had funded studies at MIT and other universities to inform our understanding of the issue. As time has gone by, those studies have continued. More data has been gathered. More sophistication in our ability and the scientists' ability to create models that are better, more competent in their analysis. With all of that, though, the facts remain there are uncertainties around the climate change, why it's changing, what the principal drivers of climate change are. And I think that the issue that I think is unfortunate in the public discourse is that the loudest voices are what I call the absolutist, the people who are absolutely certain that it is entirely man-made and you can attribute all of the climate change to nothing but man-made burning of fossil fuels. And on the other end of the debate, I similarly would say the absolutists who say there's absolutely no relationship. And the truth of the matter, based on our investigation, is it's somewhere in between. Mm-hmm. Climate science is probably one of the most extraordinarily complex areas of scientific study that anyone can undertake. The variables are numerous. Many of the variables are measurable and we can replicate models. Many of the variables, we cannot measure them, we cannot model them, but we know they're part of the climate system. And so the models are extraordinarily complicated, and therefore, how certain do you feel about the competency of the model and its ability to predict the future? And it's my view that the models have become increasingly more competent because of high-speed computing capabilities and just more sophisticated mathematical modeling and more data to inform the model. But at the end of it, there are still a range of uncertain outcomes around these models. And every scientist I know agrees there's a range of uncertainty. And if you read the IPCC detailed reports, they talk about these ranges of uncertainty as well.
But there's no great difference of opinion on the impact of CO2 emission into the atmosphere.
There is, in terms of the impact
of CO2,
there is a difference, I think, a range in that model as to what the impact of 600 ppm versus 400 ppm or 300 ppm would be. There are some ranges around those numbers even, because it's not clear when you introduce that into the climate model how some of the other elements that we're not able to model so well may act in a different way. It is clear that there's an impact.
Right.
What's not clear is our ability to measure with a great degree of accuracy or certainty exactly how large that impact will be. And that's why most of the impact studies you see have ranges around them.
And we've had a series of weather incidents, and some people believe there's a link between those weather incidents, Hurricane Sandy and others, and what's happening in terms of global warming. Do you believe there is some link there?
I have seen no scientific studies to confirm
not a specific storm,
there's
but
a link.
Nothing. In terms of those kinds of direct outcomes, you see no link.
There has been nothing to confirm that there is a link. And we look at the studies, and most of the concerns people have that there is a link, it is a hypothesis at this point. And so in science, you have a hypothesis. Now you must go and conclude and confirm the hypothesis.
Here's what I understand about your position on this, that this world has been able to adapt to many things, and that it is a manageable problem, that we can deal with global warming if we focus on it, if we understand it, and if the models are accurate.
Well, I view global warming and climate change as a serious risk. And I'm in the risk management business. That's basically what our company does, is manage all kinds of risk. And we're very comfortable managing risks that have a wide array of uncertainty around them. So as I look at climate change and global warming as a risk management challenge for policymakers, then I think you undertake it like we manage all risks. You take steps, sensible steps that can mitigate the risk by controlling the rate of growth of greenhouse gas emissions through a lot of the things we've talked about. But you also have to contemplate the alternative outcomes that could say, even if I do everything that I can possibly do, and even if I hold greenhouse gas emissions to some concentration level, what if it turns out there's more to it than that, and we still have these consequences that everyone worries about: rising sea levels, storm activity.
Meaning
droughts.
It's coming from some other source?
Meaning that the climate system, that there are other elements of the climate system that may obviate this one single variable that we're concentrating on, because we're concentrating on a single variable in a climate system that has more than 30 variables. We're only working on one. And so that's that uncertainty issue, Charlie, that I'm very comfortable dealing with the fact that I don't know. But what I do know is it's serious. I need to manage the risks. So take mitigation steps. But I need to be thinking about, so what do I want to do in the event that I can't control the outcome, or the outcome occurs in spite of what I've done? And that's where my engineering thinking comes into the equation, because as I have been quoted as saying, there are engineering solutions to these events. I'm not talking about geoengineering to try to geoengineer the cloud.
Right.
I'm talking about where we build, where we locate people, how we mitigate the effects of storms. And those are sensible things to me to do, because even if the storms are unrelated to climate change, they still have the same devastating impact on individuals and property. Why aren't we doing some things policy-wise to deal with that, whether it has to do with climate change or not?
Do we have a national energy policy?
No.
And whose failure is that?
Well, and I've said many times, we've had a national energy policy for years, and our policy has been to incentivize other countries to develop their oil and natural gas and sell it to us at a price that we really like.
And we incentivize it by what?
By being a big consumer.
Right, exactly.
By being a big consumer, a reliable consumer. And in return, there are trade relations established and other foreign relations established. But I think, the fault lies ultimately with our leaders and our policymakers. I understand.
Republican or Democrat?
Both. This is a nonpartisan issue. And I think it lies in large measure a result of our system of governing, where we change our leaders every sometimes 4 years, every 2 years, every 8 years. And energy policy requires you to think in terms of very long time frames. It requires you to put steps in place and stay with those steps through a lot of ups and downs, but be consistent with it. Energy is such a huge part of our economy and our life and our world that there are a lot of people interested in it, and there are always a lot of other people who have something they'd like to say about what should be done.
As you know, there are many people who suspect that oil companies, those like Exxon, have huge amounts of influence in Washington. And if you wanted a national energy policy, you could get one.
I wish that were true. I've participated, others of my counterparts have participated in a wide array of discussions directly through the National Petroleum Council, which has produced some, I think, truly important reports and works, yet the results of those reports seem to never translate themselves into policy. I can't really explain why, because these are very thoughtful, very far-reaching undertakings.
You are a giant company, the highest market cap in the world. A huge company, even though the number of employees has declined a bit because of efficiencies or whatever the reason might be. There are those who ask this question about Exxon. Are you an American company or are you something else?
We're an American company. There should be no mistake about that. We have a long history and heritage of our roots are here in America. The fact that we are also an international company is also a part of who we are, and we have been as well, international and global, for most of that more than 125-year history. If you look at the makeup of our employees, 60+% of our employees are non-U.S. citizens. But that's just reflective of the fact that we have significant operations in over 44 countries around the world. So as one might expect, we're going to populate ourselves with people who work in those countries.
Does that mean that when Exxon makes a decision, it's also thinking about what's in the national interest in terms of energy especially?
Well, I think anything that promotes global energy security is in U.S. national interest. And so any steps we take to develop new resources, to promote trading relationships, to promote stability in countries from a socioeconomic, a geopolitical perspective, that is all in U.S. national interest. We do not represent the U.S. government as we travel around the world. We never pretend to do that, and we never ask the U.S. government to do anything on our behalf. We're perfectly willing and prefer to enter countries, construct our contracts, and make our negotiations Exxon Mobil to the host country.
You know that former President Bush 43 supposedly said nobody tells those guys what to do.
Well,
he lives in your hometown.
Yes, he does, and he's a wonderful man, and we do see each other from time to time.
Have you heard that quote before?
I have from him and some others. I hope it's made in a positive way, because I hope people do not see us as being indifferent to national interest. I think our company, our employees, we're all very patriotic about our country. We're also supportive of our employees in other countries and how they feel about their own national interest. At the end of it, it's up to me and the leadership in the corporation to ensure that at all times, though, we are consistent with all of the laws, all of the rules, wherever we are operating anywhere in the world.
As you know, Steve Cole wrote a book about Exxon. Did you read it?
I've not.
Why not?
Well, I have a limited discretionary amount of time to read.
Well, this is about Exxon, the company that you've worked for all your life,
so
and a company that, and Steve Cole is a very good journalist, I mean, I'll say on his interest.
I've read some reviews of the book. In all honesty, I haven't taken the time to read it, because when I do read, I tend to read things that are more useful to my day-to-day decision making and inform me, or to just get a little bit of enjoyment from reading.
You think you might not have enjoyed this?
I'm sure I'll get around to it.
Well, it was about the power of Exxon is what it was.
I'm sure I'll get around to it.
It was almost like a state into itself. That's the central argument that he makes. And that it almost has a mindset that is unique because of its power.
I have heard others make the comment to me that there's an allusion to or a reference to Exxon Mobil having its own State Department.
Yes, that's right.
I would tell you it's not quite that organized, but
do you wish it was?
No, because I think we're very efficient in how we go about it. And when you're in the countries that we conduct business in, and the countries where we need to be because they are resource-rich countries, we're in a lot of countries where the geopolitics are complex. And part of our risk management and my risk management responsibilities is to understand that, to develop important relationships, and at the end of it, is no surprise, all things come down to your personal relationships. In any country, when you're going to make significant commitments, you have to look the head of state of that country eyeball to eyeball and say to them, I'm going to make this commitment, now I'm counting on you to meet your commitments. Because I will be here a long time, and over the course of the time that I'm here, there will come a day when we'll have disagreements, and things won't be going the way you want them, or they won't be going the way I want them.
And you're asking them to do what?
That I have their personal commitment that they'll stand behind their side of the bargain. And that's all I can ask. I know the deal I'm entering into. I've accepted it. You've accepted it. The only thing we can ask of each other now is that we will always honor this deal and our commitments to that. And when problems arise, we'll work it out. We'll find a way to work it out.
Did Exxon have deals with Gaddafi in Libya, Hussein in Iraq, none in Iran?
None in Iran. We had none in Iraq with Hussein. We were there prior to Hussein's term of power, and of course we're back in Iraq now. We had some exploration blocks in Libya that we entered into in the post-normalization of relations with Libya and Colonel Gaddafi. So I had...
When he gave up his nuclear ambitions.
So I had a conversation very much like that with him.
Do you think you were talking to a rational man?
Yes, believe it or not. He was pretty rational in the meeting I had with him, where we talked about what I was going to do and the things, and we had some other things we thought we could do, and his interest in that, and that, you know, all that I can expect is that he'll stand by his side of the deal, and I promised him I'll stand by mine.
If you look at the future of fossil fuels, how long are those sources of energy going to be with us?
You know, it's interesting, Charlie, if you look inside, I don't think we have it in our most recent energy outlook, but in years past, we had a fold out in our energy outlook that showed the 120-year history of energy consumption in the world. And it began way back here with timber. And timber was the principal energy source in the world. And then suddenly coal came into the picture. And it took about 50, 60 years for coal to displace timber. And then suddenly crude oil was found. And then it took about 60, 70 years for crude oil and the natural gas. And so it takes 100 years or more for some new breakthrough in energy supply to penetrate the market sufficiently to become the dominant source. And I think, as we all know, there are a lot of efforts underway to find other sources of energy. They're not our traditional sources of oil, natural gas, and coal, and there's been progress in that area. The challenge that most people, I think, have difficulty coming to grips with is the sheer enormity of energy consumption. And so if we look at our own energy outlook and we look at things like renewable wind, solar, biofuels, we have those sources of energy over the next 30 years growing 700 and 800%. But in the year 2040, they'll supply 1%.
Even though they're growing that fast?
Even though because they're growing from such a small base. And the total demand for energy is growing on a much larger base dramatically as well.
Because of the rise in Asia of
the developing
economic development of those countries and a growing middle-class population.
Yes. Yeah. So what's important is that as we look out there, there will be sufficient traditional fuels, oil, natural gas, coal, to still power economies, while these newer sources are growing. And as they grow, technology will improve, next generation will be developed, and a lot of the challenges that we're unable to overcome today in those sources will eventually be overcome. And as they do, then they begin to grow, just like coal replaced trees and oil replaced coal. And I don't think it'll happen in my lifetime, but it's not beyond my view that eventually things will evolve to that.
And Exxon wants to promote the idea of multiple sources of energy. There's no reason for the company not to want to see the fullest exploitation of all sources of energy. Because you have the resources to take advantage of getting on the cutting edge of those resources. By that I mean financial resources and development resources.
We have always said that it is important that we pursue all forms of energy because we are a technology-based company. We believe in technology. But we also know that we have an enormous responsibility because, as I said, look out, if I can look out for the next 30 years, in the year 2040, oil, natural gas, coal are still going to supply 80% of the world's energy needs. Whether we desire that to be the future or not, that's just going to be the facts. Exactly. So we're in that business, and we do support developing alternative sources of energy and other supplies because to supply each incremental growth in that demand, we're constantly having to push our technology out to new frontiers. You remember all of the discussions of peak oil theorists.
Right.
And
what happened to that?
I used to always tell them, well, the problem with that theory is you're presuming you know the size of the container. And technology keeps enlarging the container and enlarging the size of the container. Resources that we long knew were in deep water, 10,000 feet of water, but that we said we had no way.
No technology to reach it.
We had no way to know how to get there. Well, now it's routine. Arctic resources, don't know how we'll do it. Well, today we're producing them. Unconventional shale oil, tight oil, knew it was there, could not extract it commercially. Now it's on this enormous growth trend. So it's all technology enabled, and so that's why we believe technology will enable these other
There is no
supplies.
bigger subject in the energy field than natural gas. That is, everybody's talking about it. They talk about it, how it adds to American economic security because you're no longer dependent on gas. Secondly, they look at it as somehow replacing coal or making less of a dependence on coal. Give me your sense of why you saw this coming and made a huge capital investment.
Well, we actually saw this shift coming more than a decade ago. And our first move into recognizing and securing participation in the growing role of natural gas was the establishment and creation of our huge liquefied natural gas platform in Qatar with Qatar Petroleum. Qatar is now the largest exporter of LNG in the world from being almost a non-player in the early 90s.
And with it, it's become a political player.
All of that, yeah. All of that enabled by technology advancements. So we secured that, and we were watching what was going on in this shale unconventional resource in North America, which was largely pioneered by the independents.
And why is that? Why wouldn't Exxon have pioneered that? I mean, you had better resources.
Well, the nature of that resource at that time was to develop a small amount of resource with one well and then another well. And so as we looked at it, we said, you know, the materiality of that resource has not been established for us. It's not that we couldn't go do that, but we were not convinced that the technology was going to enable the resource to become material, significant. Well, that's been proven to be the case now, and so as we watched that be confirmed, and we continue to hold our views that natural gas will be the fastest growing source of energy supply over the next 30 years because of its abundance now, its affordability, but very importantly, its desirable aspects of it environmentally. Lower emissions, greater thermal efficiency, easily deployed.
Is it, in a word, the solution to our energy problems?
Well, I would hate to hang the hat on that alone, but it is.
You believe it's historic?
It is transformational. What has happened in North America because of the technologies of horizontal steerable drilling and combining that with hydraulic fracturing, which has also, the technology been pushed out. That's what enables shale gas, which has now been applied to tight oil resources that we similarly never thought would be commercial. That's the transformational piece of it, is the combination of both the natural gas and the development of significant tight oil resources in the United States and Canada that is really changing this dynamic globally.
When will America become energy independent?
Well, if we stay
I
on
assume North America, maybe include all North America.
Yeah, and really we talk about it as North America because Canada and the U.S., and even to a lesser extent Mexico, are very integrated in the infrastructure and the transportation systems to move energy back and forth. In our own outlook, we forecast that in the year 2020, on a net imports basis, we will be neutral to net exporting, and that includes crude oil and products, fuel products. So we'll still be importing some gasoline, but we'll be exporting a lot of gasoline.
Just for the record, my understanding is that in terms of oil, Saudi Arabia is number one.
Russia's number one.
Saudi Arabia is
number two.
U.S.
We're number three.
Number three. Natural gas.
Russia. Well, we surpassed Russia last year, so we're now number one. Russia's number two.
Yeah. And so the implications of that are historic in terms of what it can do to the energy equation.
Well, I think what it does is it moves the United States a substantial way down the path to energy security. And that has always been, in my view, what we should aspire for as a nation is energy security. Energy independence carries so many different connotations for people.
Essentially, it means you have enough access to enough sources.
Yeah, energy security means that I can access the energy I need reliably and affordably to fuel my economy. And the fact that we have more domestic supplies gives us greater flexibility where we want to access those other supplies that may be available to us at actually a lower cost than what we can produce here domestically, but I have domestic supplies that are also available. So it increases our optionality is what it does.
And environmental activists clearly are concerned about fracking.
Well, there is a lot of concern, I think largely misplaced. Perhaps people don't understand the way in which we construct these wells and carry out the operation to protect freshwater zones. And most of the concern is concerns that we're going to contaminate fresh water. We've been hydraulically fracturing wells in this country since the 1960s in a meaningful way. Over 1 million wells have been hydraulically fractured in the United States. And there has not been a documented case of substantial or even, I would argue, insignificant contamination of fresh water as a result of hydraulic fracturing. Now, what I say to people is, you know, with 1 million data points over 50 years, if it was a problem, don't you think we would have figured that out by now? It would have manifested itself somewhere, yet no one can actually find an incident where that has been the case. So I think the fears are misplaced. Some has been through a lot of less than perfect information that's been provided.
Well, you blame the media in part too.
Well, I chided the media for not doing their homework. Go do your homework. 1 million wells, you can find where most of them are. Go out and talk to people. If there was a problem, state regulators would have already been all over this.
So what could upset this idea? Is there something that could be an impediment in the road that we can't foresee for all the potential of natural gas?
Well, the
price might be one, but
yeah, price could be, but that will correct itself.
Right.
If the markets are left alone, eventually, the markets always will send the right signal to cause the supply to be developed. So it's largely, I think, regulatory policy is what could upset the realization of this tremendous potential for our economy and our energy security.
Some people may make the point that while you may be in favor of regulations, some of the smaller companies can't. They don't have the resources to live within the same regulations.
Well, most of the small companies, all the small companies, and these independents that really are the folks that are responsible for confirming the viability of this, have long operated under state regulations. If they don't operate and comply with those state regulations, they're not in business very long, because you just can't go out and just ignore the regulatory oversight in the state of Texas or Oklahoma or Louisiana or North Dakota, anywhere else.
In terms of drilling, whether it's Alaska or offshore or wherever it might be, is your philosophy drill, baby, drill?
No, my philosophy is to make money. And so if I can drill and make money, then that's what I want to do. But it really is, for us, it's about making quality investments for our shareholders. And it's not a quality investment if you cannot manage the risk around it. Right. And so part of that decision to undertake, whether it's a drilling program or an investment program in some other country, we have to have a very good understanding of what risk are we dealing with, how are we going to manage those? Because you may have a fabulous opportunity, but if you manage the risk poorly, you've cost yourself not only that opportunity, but you've probably cost yourself a lot of others.
Yeah. How do you evaluate what happened to BP in the Gulf?
Well,
not good risk management.
Well, there were a number of practices, and I did comment before Congress and before a couple of the commissions that a number of operating practices around the drilling of that well were not what I would have called industry standard. And I made the comment we would never have drilled a well the way that well was drilled, and that is true.
You would have drilled in those waters, but not drilled that way.
We have drilled in those waters, and we've drilled a lot of wells. And BP had drilled a lot of wells successfully in those waters.
But isn't that what scares people, that some human error will fail, even though you and a lot of other people believe it's safe?
Well, this was this wasn't just one human error. This was a series of events in which certain technical judgments were made in error for reasons that I really wouldn't want to speculate on, and it was the accumulation of these decisions that led to the ultimate failure of the system and the tragedy. There are always multiple opportunities to manage these risks, and there were multiple opportunities in this incident to have managed the risk, and they were not managed. Now that's what a lot of this trial is about that's underway right now. So
But are there lessons to be learned from, even though you're not BP?
Well, we all learned lessons from it. We studied it very carefully, and there have been there's been a lot of documentation around just the technical aspects of what happened. What is it that people were seeing that you could have made a different choice? Why they made the choice they made is not clear to many, but it's clear that this was avoidable. There was nothing in this well that was particularly unusual to the kinds of wells exploration wildcats we drill all the time. And most technical people and my own experience in drilling a lot of wells, when I read the technical reports, this was avoidable.
And Exxon Valdez, what were the lessons there?
Well, I think there were many lessons out of Exxon Valdez. Obviously, there was a breakdown in leadership on the ship itself. There was a breakdown of oversight, again, by the regulator, the Coast Guard in some respects. The actual incident itself, was an operating error on the part of someone in charge of the ship. The response to the incident, there were errors in the response made, delays that could have mitigated the impact. I think what it said to ExxonMobil, or Exxon at the time, Exxon Corporation, were a couple of things. One, that incident, as remote as it was, because of the way in which that incident would be perceived by people everywhere, that had a huge impact then on the company, its reputation, and a huge impact on its employees elsewhere. So how we dealt with that was extremely important to, first and foremost, our own integrity, the integrity of our employees, the integrity of our company. And the takeaway from it was something this simple should not have happened. And so why did it happen? And some of it has to do with people's mindsets, and some of it has to do with comprehensive systems and operating processes. And all of that was dealt with when the people running the company 20 years ago created what today is known as the Operations Integrity Management System in ExxonMobil. And that was put in place 20 years ago. It's been continuously improved, and today it serves as a template for most of the other people in the industry.
I think it was Warren Buffett who said, you can spend a lifetime building a reputation, and you can lose it in a day.
And that it certainly happened for Exxon Corporation with the Valdez. And all of our people are mindful of that today.
What does it do to the global economy if oil should go to $150, $175, $200 a barrel?
Well, it would have a pretty dramatic effect on economies the world over, certainly our own, but also economies elsewhere. Thriving economies in China would feel the effects of that because energy is so much a part of all economic
And all
activity.
economies are connected.
And all economies are connected. I think it's one of the reasons when people make these projections that oil could go to those levels, I've never subscribed to a view that they would ever reach that level.
You have no hypothesis that you think might become reality?
Only in the event that you take major supplying countries completely out of the supply, out of the market. If you take Saudi Arabia off the map, that's a problem.
What has potential for you? I mean, beyond natural gas, which you've expressed yourself both in terms of your resources and your brain power, beyond that, where is something that we might not know about that you're keeping your eye on because you think, this might be some here, there may be something here?
Well, I wouldn't want to exactly characterize it that way, and if there was, I probably wouldn't tell you.
I was worried about the latter, but not the former.
But we do follow very closely all of the technology developments in the non-oil natural gas space, because if there are improvements evident at rates faster than we expected, we want to know about that because we've always felt we have the financial wherewithal to enter that space anytime we choose. So some of the things we have been doing that are not, that people are aware of is we have been researching biofuels from algae, and we've been researching it from a little bit different perspective than others, working with a company called Synthetics Genomics Incorporated.
Right.
These were the people who mapped the human genome.
Right.
because we wanted to investigate with them what the possibilities around genetically modified algae might present. And so we've had a collaborative underway with them for some time. We've come to understand some limits of that technology, or limits as we understand it today, which doesn't mean it's limited forever. In fact, I think it has redirected them to go think about some things now because of the joint work we've done. But we've continued that work, moving now to more the fundamental biology around these.
And what's the potential?
Well, if I were to vision, here's where, if you could solve this problem, which we can't solve today, is if I could develop a strain of algae that I could modify biologically or genetically, and I could cause this algae to want to produce itself very rapidly, and I could cause it to want to take the oils that it produces and rather retain it in the cellular structure, which is what they do today. Yeah. And to get it, you have to crush the algae and destroy it. Rather, the algae would expel the oil rapidly, and it would do this over a cycle. And then it would do it in a controlled environment called a reactor, in which I would control the environment. I'd build that reactor right in the middle of my refinery, and I'd have an algae fuel-making machine that's
pouring it right into the refinery,
spitting off this fuel that looks a lot like diesel, by the way, when it expels it.
Now, do you have scientists telling you that's a reality that could happen?
With enough technology advancement, it is a possibility. And what we know is, we know reactor design. That's what we're good at. This is what we build inside our refineries and our chemical plants. What we need is someone who can make an algae for me that'll do what it'll do. The Tillerson vision of what I want an algae to do, to behave. Yeah. And so that's pretty far out there. And once you perfect
pretty far out there, is what, 25 years?
Well, probably further than that. Okay. These are very challenging problems because, and the reason we engage in them is because we want to understand how high is the hurdle, not necessarily from a threat standpoint, but from an opportunity standpoint. And with the work we've done to this point in this particular space, what we've come to understand is the hurdle's pretty high, and the hurdle seems to exist at the basic science level, which means it's even more difficult to solve. If it's operating at something that says, well, up here I understand the science, and if I could just modify this a little bit, then I can get a breakthrough, that's one level of difficulty. When you take things down to their most fundamental level and you say, the reason this doesn't work is that God just didn't create it to do that. Now, how you want to deal with that? That's a lot tougher. Doesn't mean because of these interesting things that people are doing with genomics and hybrids and all, that you may not be able to fundamentally alter that. But the pathway by which you get there is not as certain. And so it means it's probably further out there.
It's hard to bet against science, though, isn't it?
Never bet against science. Never.
Because you see in anybody's lifetime. I mean, it's extraordinary what we've seen.
Just in our lifetime.
The genome, the brain.
The way we work today, I would never have dreamed in my company that we would be doing the things we're doing. I stand in awe of my engineers and scientists and what they do today that I never would have dreamed possible when I was a young engineer working.
Imagine this for a moment. The President of the United States calls you and says, Rex, I'd like you to come down to the White House and let's have a conversation. These are tough times for me, and I'm trying to do the best I can. You know energy as well as anybody knows energy. I'm beginning a new administration here. I've got a new energy secretary. The world is a tough place, and the neighborhoods in this world that are really tough. And I need you to help me, tell me, in terms of energy, which is vital. Bill Gates says it's the #1 concern he has, and he's involved in lots of things. What do we need to do? You would say to him what?
Well, I think we need to agree on our national priorities around energy. Try and frame that in a way that it informs us, the people that are in that business, but not just us that are in the fossil fuel business, but it informs others who are pursuing other forms of energy, and map a way forward that allows, in my view, allows the market forces to come to bear on how those options and alternatives are sorted through and advanced. Much of what's been done to this point has been an enormous amount of interference with that process of discovery and perfection and improvement. And it's been by well-intended people. And I appreciate that it's been by well-intended people who want to promote the advancement of alternative energy sources. But in the kinds of programs that have been put in place that involve mandates and enormous incentives, in effect price controls on how the energy offtake occurs from wind power and solar power, that I've always expressed to people that what you have really done is you have shackled the innovative process. Because what drives innovation in many respects is failure. That I'm that close, if I could just get it, if I could just overcome this, I've got the winner. And so when it is succeeding for false reasons, it's succeeding because it doesn't have a competitor, it's succeeding because it is so incentivized. What we've really done is slowed down the process of innovation and breakthrough. I think there are enormous challenges around these alternatives which need to be dealt with. And so I think it's more a question of how does the U.S. government want to support and promote the research activities that are necessary to take these forms of energy to a different level of performance. And whether that's battery technology, or whether it's efficiencies of wind, or whether it's transmission systems that behave in different ways. How do you want to supply the underlying research, but then allow the commercial activities up here to move about in the free market?
So you're saying you want to see government plant more seed money in terms of an investment in terms of the alternative possibilities.
And there are good models for this. There are good models in the national labs. There are great models through DARPA. There are models out there that have served us well.
Gave us the internet.
We have so much intervention right now in these energy markets that, in my view, it's not been healthy for the advancement of those alternatives.
So you're saying less regulation and more more research?
More fundamental research, less mandates. I mean, wind has received subsidies for more than 20 years now. Maybe if we took the subsidy off and it was challenged to have to perform, people would take it to a new level. They haven't had to. They haven't had to. So I think a lot of this is, how do you want to structure our pursuit of our future energy supplies? And the President has said he is a proponent of all of the above, and we are too. We are too. That's a very sensible strategy. And how do you want to use the things that are very sure and we know how to use them? Use them better. Use oil better. Use gasoline, diesel, use all that stuff better. And there are things we yet can do while you're pursuing, though, that next generation that is everyone's vision. Mm-hmm. How do you want to lay the roadmap out to do that and put the roadmap in place so that it survives you, Mr. President? Because none of your predecessors have been successful at doing that.
Have you had this conversation with him?
I've had parts of that conversation with him, and I've had it with others.
No. So you think he has a listening ear, that he wants to hear what you have to say?
He has a lot of people speaking into that ear.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Charlie.
Rex Tillerson, the CEO of Exxon Mobil, the largest company in the world in terms of market capitalization. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.